Thank you.
Okay, good. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you had a wonderful lunch. You've had a fascinating morning, and we've got two wonderful sessions this afternoon. The first of which on international trade and climate change. And it's a particularly great pleasure that the person who will be leading the discussion this afternoon is someone I've known for nearly 25 years now, a very good friend and Executive Director of the International Centre for Trade and Sustainable Development, Ricardo Melendez-Ortiz. Ricardo.
Well, thank you all very much, and welcome to this session. We will be dealing with a topic that is, even though many of us spend a lot of time on it, I know it's not sort of the everyday soup for everybody here. But we're very happy that it has come to these halls. It's the question of the interface between international trade policy, particularly international trade and investment frameworks, and climate change. We have a great panel today, this afternoon. We will be joined by Roberto Acevedo as he makes his way through traffic, and who will just join us in that chair that you see there. And then I have with me Bruno Lafont to my left, who is the co-chairman of Lafarge-Holcim. Lafarge-Holcim is probably known to many of you. It is the largest producer of cement in the world. Then we have Jean-Louis Chaussat. And Jean-Louis is the CEO of Suez, one of the largest water services companies in the world. Then next to Jean-Louis is Reinhard Quick. Reinhard is, again, an old hand on these debates, and he's the Brussels-based director of the European Chemical Industry Association. And then we have John Danilovich, the Secretary General of the International Chamber of Commerce, former ambassador of the US, and a very knowledgeable person also on these matters. As I said, we're going to be dealing with the question of trade and climate change. Climate change with its current governance setup, but we hope it's the regime that should take us through 2020 and beyond, the Paris Agreement. Now, to be implemented in an experimental hybrid approach that would see a bottom-up set of contributions coming from governments, particularly in the form of what is called nationally determined contributions, should take us to what we all expect will be the 2-degree increase in climate that should stabilize climate. To do that, countries have been asked to decide on the measures and the policies that they will individually take to try to contribute again individually to get us to that collective goal. That's a very big bet, and we're all hoping we would get there. It's a very big bet because it would basically be a mix of policies and measures, not necessarily coherent, very diverse, and in some cases probably competitive between them. It will probably also, because we live in a globalized economy, have the consequence of positive and negative spillovers across borders that will be transmitted particularly to trade in goods and services. In a global economy where we trade mostly on intermediate goods, the components of technologies and tasks, services, which is governed by and large, let me put it that way, rules at the World Trade Organization for those goods and services, and then a whole plethora of other international trade and investment agreements, over 240 trade agreements of bilateral and plurilateral nature, as well as over 3,400 bilateral investment treaties and other forms of international investment agreements. The question is how to ensure that that regime that we have in place supports efforts to address climate change. And particularly, how to ensure that it supports this idea of Paris of bringing nationally determined contributions. So policies and measures, again, that countries would determine by themselves to get us there. That's not a very simple question. It's actually quite complex. It goes at least to two sides of that coin. One is, how do we ensure that goods and services that are necessary to address climate change, for instance, the massive and rapid transition that we all required into clean energy technologies, so that the energy mix is not rich in carbon as the one that we have in place today, it's really enabled. That's one side of that coin. The other side of that coin is, how do we make sure that the rules that we have in place address questions of competitiveness that may arise when countries take measures that will impose costs on their producers or will tackle consumption-based emissions in ways that, again, may disadvantage the participation of some and not others in international trade and the global economy. So there are at least these two sides, again, to that same coin. On the first side, how do we ensure that we have robust markets that respond, again, to the needs for clean energy goods and services in the global economy, particularly those that are necessary to clean the energy mix, one that is responsible for about 80% of emissions in global terms. There are some efforts going on, and I hope that we get Roberto Acevedo, the Director General of the WTO, to join us to talk about some of them. On one hand, the countries of APEC, of the Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation, have decided to liberalize tariffs in what they call environmental goods, which account for some of those components of those technologies that are necessary for that build-up of renewable energies. On the other hand, a number of countries in the WTO, 40 if you count individually the members of the European Union, have also decided to go now into plurilateral negotiations to try to come up with an agreement on what they call environmental goods, the Environmental Goods Agreement, the EGA, which again involves some of those goods and services. So that's a contribution by making trade more efficient and therefore, again, allowing for the creation of robust markets where they are needed. But they're probably insufficient. They don't deal with non-tariff barriers. They don't deal with services in this global value chain-based global economy. So how are we going to get there? Again, I hope we get some responses from our panel in that respect. On the other question, that of competitiveness, how we deal with that. For a number of years, we have now been looking at the possibilities of, for instance, using carbon measures to try to ensure that efforts in one market are equivalent to measures in the other market, or that there's compensation between producers in various markets. Do we have the right rules in place? What do we do? Where do we negotiate the cooperation at the international level that is necessary to really take us through 2020 and beyond into a world that will make the kind of effort that is called for in the Paris Agreement towards a lower carbon-dependent economy? So that's what we're here to discuss. Let me turn with sort of an announcement to the audience that both Jean-Louis Chaussat and Bruno Lafont will have to leave us at 2:45. So, okay. So let me
allow me to stay.
Okay,
on stage.
good. Mm-hmm. So let me turn first to Bruno, perhaps, to give us his thoughts, coming from an industry that is particularly the focus of discussions and, again, it's very much an actor in the midst of these kind of dilemmas that we have. Before giving you the floor, let me recognize the presence of Ambassador Roberto Acevedo, the Director General of the WTO, who has just joined us. Roberto just went through an introduction of sort of very generally what the big questions are, both from the perspective of creating robust markets for the kind of goods and services that we need to tackle the challenge that we have ahead, as well as the more perhaps challenging question of what do we do about the competitiveness issues that may come along with implementing the nationally determined contributions of national governments to achieve the objectives of the Paris Agreement. So I was just turning first to Bruno Lafont, who has to leave early before we finish the panel, to give us his views, and then I'll come back to you. Bruno, you've got the floor.
Thank you for inviting somebody representing the industry, and the industry which is very much impacted by the change. First, I want to say that for us, the preconditions for the success of the Paris Agreement and probably for the major part of business is first consistent, coherent, and predictable national policies implementation. The second is setting up the frame of monitoring, reporting, and verifying. Without that, there will be no fast improvement. The third is putting a price on carbon, and there the devil is in the details. And fourth is continuing the business dialogue, which has started before COP21 between business, countries, and also international organizations. So about the specific subject of climate change and international trade, we all understand that we need to transform our world, that this transformation has to go fast and smoothly. Carbon pricing is at the center of this subject. Why? Because of the open architecture of the Paris Agreement. That means that every country is free to design the pace and the policy. That means if the same carbon price applies to the world, to the entire world, there is no issue. If countries take different approaches, which is the most predictable or probable case, then we need to think about competitive distortions and what happens to business. And each business will have to make decisions, and it is a very central question. The central question is a level playing field among industries and the level playing field across geographies. And this level playing field is critically a precondition for the success of any climate change policy. Let's take the EU ETS experience. So we have lived now 15 years with it. I think carbon leakage mechanisms were effective, thanks to free allowances. But we all understand that they will not last forever, and that cannot be the only one solution. On the EU ETS experience, I would say the predictability of the system was not very high. It was high enough, but not very high. So instead of a carbon leakage problem, we had more an investment leakage problem, not knowing what would happen or knowing things could change every 5 years. It was difficult for companies to invest. And there were some other weaknesses, but we have learned about those weaknesses, and I think EU ETS system can be corrected. And if it is remaining as simple as possible and as replicable as possible, I think it's already a very good tool to start with. There were, before the Paris Agreement, no trade implication, but a lot of discussions about the legality under WTO rules of border adjustments. And we understand that border tax adjustment is a very critical issue, and it's not easy to put in place. And the first problem is how to measure the content of carbon in any export goods. And it's maybe the same in pharmaceuticals, but even for cement, it's not completely easy. So after the Paris Agreement, the compatibility and the linking between the carbon pricing systems become an absolute necessity, even more in the case of the reduction of free allowances in the different systems. And it may have a huge impact on industry, depending on what happens. Therefore, the priority is to clarify and eliminate the frictions which generally can arise between WTO rules and trade-related environmental rules. So it is important to clarify what a carbon unit is under WTO rules. Is it a good or a service? And if it is a service, under which rule is it subordinated? So that we can understand. And another point will be on how to establish those ETS systems and how to link them, avoiding conflict between WTO rules and the Paris Agreement. So the Paris Agreement implementation is a priority for industry. It is a challenging one. It is a transformational one. But if it is well prepared, if it is well thought, and all this early enough, the industry will adapt more easily with less cost and more desire to invest into the future. And for this to happen, we must have and we need a good level of cooperation between all the parties. So it starts between countries and companies, between companies themselves, and I believe also between world organizations like WTO and UNFCCC. So thank you very much.
Well, just to make sure that the public understand what we're talking about here, the Paris Agreement allows for countries' cooperation in the implementation of their NDCs, the National Determined Contributions, both through market-based measures as well as non-market approaches. Some of the market-based measures that Bruno had just referred to include emission trading schemes, and then the possibility of linking those emission trading schemes so the countries could cooperate by importing, exporting units of carbon. In the world today, we have two experiences of that sort, the EU, Switzerland linkage of the two emission trading schemes, as well as California and Quebec. The question there is, and then there is the announcements of China, which is not irrelevant, to launch a national emission trading schemes by 2017. And so the question there is also, if I understand well your questions, is how do we ensure and under what framework we ensure that this linkage takes place in a way that, we have the right frameworks for rules and investment, but also we don't discriminate and we don't affect other parties that do not have similar policies in place. But, so thank you for that, Bruno. You've introduced a couple of very important topics there. I think I'd like to just, before coming back to Roberto, I'd like to go to Jean-Louis, perhaps, before we go back to the other question of ensuring competitiveness and ensuring particularly robust markets on and goods and services, which is where you may be perhaps more, your information may be more interesting at this time. Jean-Louis.
Well, thank you again to be here with you this afternoon. First of all, I would like to share with you a strong conviction I have about the convergence between several major international policy that we are facing today. Of course, we have been talking a lot about the Paris Agreement, the COP21, which took place in December. You have also the Sustainable Development Agreement, which has been, we have been going through the 17 Sustainable Development Goals in September 2015 in New York. And then you have the financing of the development through the UN agreement in Addis Ababa in 2014, which is clear that, and you see it very well, progressively we are talking about climate change, about sustainable development, about financing. In the meantime, you see a kind of convergence between public bodies, nations, if I can say. I mean, the Paris Agreement was between the 196 UN nations. But if you have been in Paris, you notice that not only governments were taking their part of the discussions, but you had also a lot of stakeholders, cities, of course, NGOs and companies. In Paris, you had more than 2,000 different kind of stakeholders represented in the conference. So, at a time where we see so much convergence, at the meantime, we see also a specific situation in which each state is taking its own measures. And in Paris, again, it was very interesting to see that each nation had its own contributions. And when we spoke about the capacity of the world to achieve a temperature increase of less than 2 degrees, in fact, we know that it's a sum of contributions, and we know that for the time being, we are above 2 degrees. But which is interesting is to see that each nation, each country, has its own view on what shall be done. And in my view, it's going to be difficult to find a general agreement if everybody is going to look at his local level, and if we want, at the meantime, to achieve a global goal. Therefore, I think that the World Trade Organization is totally funded to try to find a way to make all those contributions being part of a general, if I can say, agreement. And that is why I think that to speak about a special agreement about environmental goods and services is something which makes a lot of sense. Now, when you say that, from my point of view of CEO, I think that, of course, free trade is probably one of the positive answers that we can expect. But in the meantime, I have some concern. First of all, custom tariff can be useful, especially, and it has been said by Bruno, if you want to protect from unfair international competitions. And I think the balance between what is fair and unfair is not that easy to define. Second, I think that we need to have a clear definition of what is an environmental product or an environmental services. In the first talk which took place, we have seen that a lot of people, a lot of companies, a lot of bodies are saying that their product, their service are partially or totally environmental. So how do we define the right sectors involved or not in this specific agreement? I think is something which, in my view, is difficult. And therefore, my recommendations, I think, is to try to define a kind of methodology which should be the same. This methodology could help to define, for example, positive externalities, can also evaluate CO2 emission, etc. We need a framework of definitions which give us the capacity and the possibility to understand what are the conditions of the games, the playing field that in which we are going or we need to play. Because without that, it's going to be extremely difficult to define a common policy, and we will remain with local policy, which I think are not good. And as Bruno Lafont said, talking about CO2 emissions, if each country has its own rule, I do not believe that at the end we will achieve the right target. So, in my view, and as a conclusion, I should say that free trade for environmental goods and services could be a positive push, and it could be a positive push to transfer rapidly technologies and services, which, in my view, a lot of countries needed if we want to reduce the environmental footprint of many different countries. I think this is part of the Paris Agreement. When we spoke about the $100 billion that has to be push by 2020 to the developing world, clearly the question of how can we do that, it's a real question mark. However, in my view, the definition of what is an environmental product or service seems to be hard, and we have to find, if I can say, right definitions in order to be much or as much balance as possible. And I know that this point is going to be very difficult to define. And moreover, I think that we need definitions for carbon price and carbon emissions. And the carbon pricing is probably at world scale one of the major issues if we want the companies like mine, to really take the right steps in order to reduce emissions and provide technologies which can reduce emissions. We need to have, again, a stable framework of definitions and also of price or pricing. If not, we will be unable to achieve this worldwide necessary target of no more than 2 degrees by 2100. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jean-Louis. Let me move immediately to Reinhard before I come back to Roberto. But Reinhard, so you've heard now both Bruno and Jean-Louis talk about the question of liberalizing goods and services that are necessary for climate change, to address climate change, but also the issue of competitiveness. Why should we, you've been working on this for a number of years, why should we give a particular treatment to goods and services that are, again, related to addressing climate, as opposed to the other goods and services that have been pending now in terms of attention, if you like, in liberalization for a number of years? What makes them critical to really guarantee or warrant that you give them expedite treatment and special treatment in a way in the liberalization of goods and services? But also, how do you define those? And when it comes to competitiveness, why pay attention and how to do this to carbon-related measures and policies and justify that you don't do the same, say, for other industrial emissions and measures that may cause, again, competitiveness, negative spillovers between policies in one market and another market with respect to say, other type of environmental public goods? So, Reinhard.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here. Ricardo now gave me several questions which I could elaborate about at least for the next hour. I'm not going to do that, but I hope I can give you some answers. I would like to start first by asking a different question, and that is, what can Paris do for trade, and not how can trade accommodate climate? Because we have two completely different systems. One is a Paris Agreement, which we all find great and which we have all applauded when it was negotiated. But on the other hand, we have a WTO system which has teeth, which has a mandatory dispute settlement system. And I have the impression, ladies and gentlemen, that we apply here a beggar thy neighbor policy. We don't have dispute settlement in climate change. So when it comes to not agreeing with another country what their nationally determined contributions are, let's impose some unilateral measures on them and then go to the WTO and see whether we can justify them. I would very much hope that the drafters of the UNFCCC and of the Paris Agreement and the whole climate community helps us in deciding what measures can and should be taken. Because I think it's overburdening the WTO to ask questions about competitive distortions, and I'll come to that. So I think we do here beggar thy neighbor, namely use a useful system, that of the WTO dispute settlement, in order to accommodate domestic measures which would probably not be accommodated when we negotiate them at the same time in Paris. And therefore, we, as a chemical industry, are very much in favor of defining what measures could be taken, which then can be accommodated in the WTO. But I think it needs a start in the Paris Agreement. Now, what kind of changes do we need for the WTO? I would say, if you look at the dispute settlement of the WTO, in particular with trade and environment, the WTO dispute settlement has accommodated sovereign environmental decisions to a large extent. They always interfere whenever there is a sort of discrimination or when the measure is not meant to protect the environment but protect the competitiveness of the domestic industry. And that the WTO can and should not allow, cannot and should not allow. So I'm very skeptical with proposals to change the WTO rules, in particular the definition of light product. And I give you an example. Do you really want that a polystyrene, which is needed to insulate houses, or polyurethane, which is also needed to insulate houses, be treated differently because of the energy input it receives? So should we distinguish between polystyrene, which is made from coal energy, and polystyrene, which is made from renewable energy? And if so, what kind of consequences would that have for the WTO? And therefore, I'm very skeptical with kind of these proposals, and I would suggest we need a discussion, but let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater by just thinking we need to do something for the climate, that then we can change the WTO rules in such a way that we would not recognize the WTO afterwards anymore. And lastly, that brings me to the discussion on environmental goods. I'm a very strong supporter of trade liberalization, and I think we have a very good record as chemical industry to favor further trade liberalization. We have made in 1990 a proposal which then eventually came as a result in the Uruguay round of chemical tariff harmonization. And since 1995, we speak about tariff elimination for chemicals. And I mean complete elimination for all chemicals, ladies and gentlemen. But we have not succeeded so far. In the meantime, other initiatives have started. And here we now see an initiative like the environmental goods negotiations, which we are very critical of. Because you cannot produce a solar panel without chemicals. You cannot produce a wind turbine without chemicals, but our products are not on the list. And that leads me to the question, what kind of definitions do we give to what is an environmental good? And here I would say, rather than the approach to have lists and which are inherently discriminatory, I give you just two examples. Are bicycle an environmental good? Is bioethanol an environmental good? In the European Union, we have a 60% tariff on bioethanol, just to mention in passing. So if we want to promote, and that's what the WTO and the OECD want to do, global value chains, I would suggest we need to have a much bigger approach to tariff negotiations in order to promote technologies and in order to promote the goods which we need in order to protect the climate. Thank you.
Thank you, Reinhard. That gives us, I think, a perfect leeway to the Director General of the WTO. So you've heard three different positions from the industry on these issues, particularly on the liberalization of goods and services that are required to address climate change. Let me just sort of expand a bit on the questions that have been put on the table. Beyond tariffs, in a world of value chains, we have to be worried about non-tariff barriers. Many have argued that many of the goods, for instance, on environmental technologies, specifically on clean energy technologies, if they are not accompanied with a liberalization of the services that are embedded or that are essential for the functioning of those technologies, then there's very little that is being gained. So what to do about the environmental services? And is there a possibility in the WTO to address these issues? And further than that, the use of remedies, anti-dumping, questions related to countervailing of subsidies, In 2008, 2014, in publications of ICTSD, we have estimated that about 40 billion US dollars have been targeted on our remedies that are targeting green services particularly. It is the largest segment of the industry that is targeted by anti-dumping duties. Is there anything that should be done about the rules to allow, again, the growth and the consolidation of that industry? Same with subsidies, and probably similarly with the rules of local content requirements. Countries think that by generating an industry that could provide jobs and growth on environmental goods and using local content requirements as industrial policy, they would kill several birds with the same sort of approach. Is there anything that should be done about those local content requirements? Finally, on fossil fuel subsidies, there are more more subsidies granted to the fossil fuel industry than to environmental goods, about double, so about over $600 billion a year. Is there anything that the WTO can do about those to level the playing field on the energy field? So with those few questions, and in addition to those that Rainer has put on the table, what is the WTO able to do, and how is it able to help with these issues? We can come back to the competitiveness issues perhaps on a second round, but if you'd like to comment on those, Roberto.
Well, first of all, good afternoon, everybody. I'm almost regretting that I came here because this conversation is really complex. So we're not definitely going to even scratch the surface in an hour, very much so. So let me try to put some points. Instead of trying to answer all of those questions, all those specifics, let me give you some broad general ideas about what the WTO is, which I think is part of the conversation. A lot of the public, they don't understand what the WTO is. They think the WTO is an organization that willingly and unilaterally decides to do certain things. It doesn't. It is the member countries who decide what to do and what is on the agenda and how to treat any specific issue. It's not the WTO per se, it's not the Secretariat, it's the member countries that will decide what to do. Now, having said that, which is a very preliminary disclaimer, let's talk a little bit about a few things. So the first one, I think nobody is advancing the idea that trade is against the environment. I don't think that's the issue, but I'll get to that. In reality, I don't know that we can envisage any successful economic policy that doesn't have trade as an important ingredient if you want it to be successful and if you want it to be sustainable. So economic growth needs trade as an important part of the policy. So that's number one. The second, two messages that I would like to give concerning the WTO. I think the first one, I think we need to dispel the perception that exists in many areas that the WTO places trade above the environment, which is just not true. In the founding agreement of the WTO, the first article, Article 1, Paragraph 1, there is a commitment for the organization to support and protect the environment and to conserve exhaustible natural resources. Now that's Paragraph 1, Article 1. So the appellate body, dispute settlement, they cannot ignore the fact that this is a very major principle. The second thing that I would like to say is that members, any WTO member has full discretion to adopt whatever environmental policy it wants to adopt at whatever level of ambition, and the WTO agreements and the rules of the WTO will not get in the way. So a member that may adopt policies that may restrict trade to preserve the environment is perfectly entitled to do that. There's nothing in the rules of the WTO that precludes that. The only requirement, and I think that has been mentioned already here in the panel, the only requirement is that this measure or this policy, whatever the policy is not a disguised way of protecting the national industry. As long as you meet that, and that's the only requirement, if it is not a disguised, a veiled way, a covert way of protecting the national industry, therefore discriminating against the foreign suppliers, you can adopt any kind of policy measure that you want, environmental or for any other public goal. So that's very important. The second point is that even in trading itself, we find ways of supporting environmental policies. For example, trade encourages producers to raise their standards. For example, I'll give you one simple one, which is energy efficiency requirements. Now, in the year 2000, of all the energy that was consumed by vehicles, appliances, industries, buildings, 10% of that energy was covered by some kind of energy efficiency requirement that was established in the regulatory bodies. Today, so there's 10% in 2000. Today, 15 years later, we're almost at 30%. And we expect by 2040 to be at 40%. Now, of course, any producer that is manufacturing something or participating in a services-related area that supplies energy to these vehicles, appliances, buildings, if they want to have access to the international markets, to the markets that apply those standards, he will have to raise the standards of his own production, otherwise he's out of the market. It's as simple as that. So that in itself is a pretty good example. Another one is green technology that is imported from overseas, so therefore from the outside your borders, to adapt to local circumstances and produce environmentally sound goods. That's the case of in Cambodia, for example. In Cambodia, there is a company now that is manufacturing solar-powered tuk-tuks. Now, in Phnom Penh alone, it's 10,000 tuk-tuks. And all that technology has been imported from abroad and manufactured with local components. Now, I don't have to tell you how important the impact of that could be in the local environment and globally, of course, and also maybe the emergence of a new environmentally sound green exporting industry in Cambodia. So these things are very important to bear in mind. We mentioned about the possibility also of agreements which very directly affect trade of environmentally sound products. The environmental goods negotiations is a clear example of that. It makes environmentally sound products more affordable, like wind turbines, solar panels, water filters. But again, we go back to the issue of what is an environmentally sound product. That discussion, I have to tell you, honestly, is almost as political as technical. That's the reality. It's not the WTO that wants that, it's members. So is a bicycle an environmentally sound product? Ethanol, is it environmentally sound or not? Any product that is more energy efficient, arguably, could be an environmentally sound product. It could be a television. It could be an air conditioning, as long as it's more energy efficient. So what is exactly, how do you decide what is an environmentally sound product? All the questions that have been raised here, for example, carbon taxes, the definition of what is or is not an environmentally sound product, fuel subsidies, the development of a cleaner energy matrix. All those issues, they are global issues. They're not going to be solved by one or two countries. And you're not going to impose your will on everybody else. So these needs international cooperation. These things need coordination, they need negotiations. These are tough conversations, extremely tough because they're politically sensitive, economically sensitive, and if you want to fix this, you have to have this conversation. I think Paris was a start, but frankly, from where I sit, Paris is a very incipient, preliminary baby step
Absolutely.
in the direction that we need to go. So that's what I can tell you. I think the instruments are there. What we need now is political will, determination to sit down and talk about the difficult things. That's what we need to do.
Thank you. That's very good. Bruno, you have to go, or can you stay with us? You have to go.
Absolutely.
So we will excuse you, and thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you.
Thank you. Allow me to turn then to Ambassador John Danilovich. So Roberto Acevedo was just saying that we have, on one hand, if I'm reading him well, we have a very structured, rather successful, global, multilateral as you can have, with 164, 66 members, framework on trade. And then you have the Paris Agreement, which is just coming into being. And we need to ensure that one supports the other. We have the imperative of action and expedite action on many of these issues. How do you see that cooperation going forward?
Thank you very much, Ricardo. That's a perfect lead into what the International Chamber of Commerce believes and is firmly committed to with regards to the agreements that have been made and where trade fits in all of this. And we've heard a lot today about how an essential facet of the response to climate change, from the need to open the global market to climate-friendly goods and services, through to opportunities to make global trade more efficient. We've also heard of the need to explore more fully how trade policy can establish a level playing field under the Paris Agreement. But taking a step back from the specifics of the agenda, I want to say a few words about the need to recalibrate the popular narrative on and between trade and the climate agenda. If you Google media coverage with the term trade and climate, you'll find a raft of newspaper headlines and blogs that point out to secretive trade agreements, clandestine meetings, power elites, etc., that are destined to scupper the Paris Agreement before the ink is dry. Their narrative is clear. Trade liberalization comes at the cost of climate action, and never the twain shall meet. But they are wrong. The fact is, open markets are still the best tool we have for increasing global welfare and motivating action on climate. We've heard quite clearly today the importance of trade when it comes to supporting and enabling climate action. So I think it's incumbent upon the global business community to explain more as to why trade matters to an increasingly skeptical public audience. And I hope that this will be the key message that flows out of the summit today of our business leaders. ICC warmly and strongly welcomes steps taken by the WTO and by Roberto to open up to business input and to ideas specifically through their initiative entitled Trade Dialogues. This was established by Roberto, and Sunil Bharti-Mittal, our new chairman, and myself participated last month in that first engagement in Geneva. It was a very robust exchange, as Roberto has pointed out, not only with, but as per usual, between the secretariats of our two organizations, the ICC and the WTO, but with the members of the WTO themselves. Last week in Sao Paulo, Roberto and I were also present, where he set the house on fire with his comments. I hope he doesn't set the Guildhall on fire. But nevertheless, his comments in Sao Paulo were absolutely strong with regards to business engagement, not only with regards to economic development, but also with regards to climate. When it comes to trade and the climate agenda, we also need to play our part in enhancing the dialogue between ongoing intergovernmental processes. Given the scale and urgency of the challenge facing us, we need joined up, connecting the dots policymaking. This is vital. That's why we want today's discussion to be about the start of a new dialogue between business and policymakers from both trade and climate areas. Roberto touched on this as well, saying that the Paris Agreement were the first incipient steps in going forward on this agenda. We need to work with the UNFCCC and the WTO going forward. To achieve this, we'd like to request support for follow-on dialogues at first, the WTO's forum in Geneva in September, and then at the COP22 in Marrakesh in November. We also want this issue to be taken up by the G20 in Germany in 2017. ICC's connection with the G20 is through the B20, the Business 20, and we are going to insist that there be a focus on this as appropriate in the 2017 German cycle of the G20. We also have a role to play in advancing the trade and climate agenda, and I know that Roberto in particular will support our call for follow-on events. And I can also assure you that the International Chamber of Commerce intends to be front and center in all of these initiatives going forward. So thank you, Ricardo, for the opportunity to speak today.
Thank you very much, John. I think that's squarely, I think, on what we need to do going forward. There's obviously, to this debate, there's a long history. It is since Rio in 1992 that governments were called to bring coherence on the questions of international trade, openness, the further integration of national economies into global markets, and the questions related to the environment. And I would say, having been a big, both on the government side as well as an observer and from a think tank perspective, having been an actor in all these years, I should say that that cooperation hasn't been perhaps as fruitful as it needs to be. Partly because we didn't have the kind of regime that we now would have put in place with Paris, and we expect that it's in place in Paris and that will take us successfully through 2020. I think it is it's high time, as you say, and I think this is what I take from all of you, that we come to a good conversation on these issues, a structured debate. I take your lead on the G20. Allow me to say that I also believe it's perhaps the instance that could give guidance on these questions, to try to get governments and other stakeholders to come together in Marrakesh, as you say, in the G20, even in September in Beijing, and then from there into the German presidency. And then perhaps in the lead, and let me get back to Roberto on this, in the lead to the next ministerial conference of the WTO in 2017, the MC11, to try to structure the dialogue. So in concluding, let me just go back to you and start perhaps with Reinhard, go to Jean-Louis, and then finally to Roberto, and ask you, how do you think this can be done going forward most immediately, and what are those issues, Reinhard?
Well, thank you. I mean, first of all, I would suggest that we seriously consider to continue further tariff liberalization, and not only result on environmental goods, but also, let me use the WTO talk, the NAMA negotiations need to be revisited, because since 2001 we are looking forward to have trade liberalization and we don't have any.
Good.
Secondly, I think we need to discuss rules. And that's where the WTO is quite bad, if I may say so, also in the presence of the Director General. That we cannot, and that's the structure of the WTO, the member states cannot agree on new rules. And as long as they can't agree on new rules, it's nice to sit here and to talk about new rules, but they need to agree them. And I really look forward to the discussion which you have started on these new rules and how to accommodate trade and climate. But I would also say that these rules have to be discussed also within Paris, not only in the WTO.
Jean-Louis.
Well, I think, and it has been said on several occasions, that it's going to be difficult to go ahead if we continue to speak about more or less the same topics in 3 or 4 different areas. We have been talking about climate change in Paris. We have been talking about sustainable development in New York. In Addis Abeba, it was about financing. And it seems to me that we need much more coordination, and including, of course, with the World Trade Organizations, in order to fix a little bit what are going to be in the future the rules of the game. Because if we want the companies, the private sector, to invest and we need to invest in new technologies, in long-term assets, etc., we need to have a set of rules which should be stable and at least the same for, I should say, large business areas. If not, it will be very difficult to ask private sector to enter in new development and new businesses. It's so easy to do the business as usual and to continue as it is, as we know how to make profit out of it. So I think convergence of all the agreements we have been talking about is needed. And second, again, we need some set of rules which are clear, defined, if we want, the private sector and also the public to invest on long-term assets that we need if we want to really start and achieve these transitions. And we need a transition from, I should say, the linear world we have been living in during the 20th century to a more circular world in the 21st century.
Thank you, Jean-Louis. Roberto?
I think, to begin, that just to make the point, it is possible to negotiate rules now in the WTO. We have just concluded a couple of years ago the Trade Facilitation Agreement. It's a very important agreement, very complex agreement. We are showing that that is not impossible. We need to be creative. We have to have flexibility when we determine what the rules are, so that we recognize that the major powers are not at the same level as a small, vulnerable economy. They're different. So we have to recognize that. If you recognize that, I think members in general, they're finding a way forward. I think the major problem here is not necessarily the difficulty to negotiate. I think the major problem here is defining what you want to negotiate.
Exactly.
Because right now we don't have that. Everybody's talking about the environment and how to preserve the environment. Even achieving a general goal with almost no specifics whatsoever about what the emissions level would be was already a major challenge. Imagine going down to the specifics which will affect industries and jobs and economic growth in a very concrete way. So I think, number one, you need really to sit down and have a conversation about what the priorities are. What are the things that we really need to talk about? And that's one of the efforts that we are having with the private sector, with the ICC and others, is to also hear the private sector and see what do they think are things that can be negotiated that will help and to move in that direction. But particularly in the case of environment, that is not enough. I think that is just part of the conversation. You need to have a conversation with many other stakeholders. Now, once we decide what is it that we want to do, what kind of constraints or what kind of disciplines, what kind of parameters we want to put in place so that everybody observes those, then there's nowhere to go. I think right now what we're missing is precisely that, is a decision on what is it that we want to negotiate. And we don't have that.
Oh.
That's very simple.
Thank you. John, last word on this?
I think this has been a very fascinating conversation we've had today. It comes back to joining up the dots, joined up writing, so to speak, getting us all on the same page. I think the point that's been made, particularly by our French colleagues, by Bruno and Jean-Louis, is not to be missed. We've started in Paris, and that is a very good starting point. The question is, now where do we go from here? Roberto's comments, I think, were spot on about the World Trade Organization in actually defining what it is we in the private sector, International Chamber of Commerce, business sector, want the WTO and other international fora, G20, B20, to do in this regard. It's imperative that we move forward, that we not lose the momentum. Despite the unfortunate Brexit vote earlier in the United Kingdom this week, I think we need to give our French colleagues every credit for the tremendous achievement they made in Paris last year with the agreement, and we now need to use that foundation going forward. We have a solid foundation. We still have their ongoing strong commitment, as you can see by their presence today, and in their involvement in the COP22 Marrakesh process. So let's build on it. Let's go forward with the combination between climate and trade and make something of the agreement that we've already established.
Thank you very much, and thank you to the four of you. I think it's clear being here in London at this time, I think we couldn't say it louder. What we need is predictability going forward. We need clear rules that are inclusive, that do take into account that kind of world in which we're going into with this new climate change agreement. Those national economies that have put forward the national determined contributions are doing so in the context of a globalized economy, an ever more interconnected economy. And we need to make sure that those frameworks for trade and investment, as well again as the measures for climate, are all coherent and consistent to take us to where we need to go. So with that, let me thank you again for being patient discussing what is a very complex subject with very little time. And thank the audience for your attention. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.